Goncharova and Larionov went on to found an artistic group with broader concerns. Rayonism was more or less isolated to the two of them. They called their group the Jack of Diamonds group because I think they saw a certain parallelism between images on playing cards and the sort of the broader circle of Cubist works. And one of the artists involved in the Jack of Diamonds group, and the artist that we'll focus on for the rest of this lecture, is Kazimir Malevich. His Woman with Pails dynamic arrangement on the left, where we can see, I think, pretty clearly, if we want to read the image, we can certainly read the arc with the pails on it here over the shoulders of the figure here. But at the same time, he's rendered the figure as a sort of mechanized, a machine-like figure. It almost looks like the Tin Woodsman from The Wizard of Oz, and very cubist in its approach by applying the same color schemes and the same sort of forms to foreground and to background. You might be immediately reminded of Léger's purism, begun also around the exact same time. And certainly the Jack of Diamonds group was wide-ranging in its interests. All forms of Cubism and all of the offshoots of Cubism really do come into play. The interesting thing for Malevich is the political message that comes to his work. The idea that he's applying mechanized forms to peasant life. This relates directly to ideas that were strong in leftist avant-garde politics in Russia. Vladimir Lenin was talking about how Russia, already in 1906, right, was talking about how Russia needed to modernize in order to improve the life of the working class. And Malevich seems to sort of follow this idea by modernizing the life of the working class, by bringing the machine to rural labor, not necessarily machinery itself, but turning the man into a machine of sorts. This seems to relate directly to ideas that are very current in the forward-thinking part of the sort of anti-czarist camp of Russian society. Malevich's earliest works are present a wide range of styles, and we can see that on one hand he's certainly looking at purist works, and on the other hand he's definitely looking at synthetic cubism. Russian artists in general are devouring the different modern movements coming out of Western Europe, sort of eating it up, all of them looking for inspiration for ways to move out of the very traditional and tight Russian art world into and really sort of go screaming into the modern world. Certainly, like the synthetic cubist movement, what Malevich is doing is he's taking snippets, parts of a mustache, parts of a uniform, an ear, a real thermometer attached to the surface, a postage stamp, and words. All of these are meant to sort of work together to create meaning, just as the Cubists has. But Malevich got a bit more theoretical about it and wrote about what he was trying to achieve in a way that seems somewhat separate from Picasso and Braque and the synthetic cubisms. And I have a very brief quote here, I think that, or not quote so much as an idea that I think is important. He says that by using this cubist technique, by using fragments and snippets rather than complete images, he says that that his art would divorce things from their original context and their original meaning. In other words, he's not trying to remind us of the original meaning, he's trying to divorce these forms from the meanings. And he said what he was trying to do was to create a sort of nonsense realism that would teleport us away from the physical world. That it would be its own separate kind of realism, and not one that evoked an experience in the modern world. but one where these forms now took on a life of their own, uh, divorced from their original meaning. And this, I think, for Malevich is maybe the most important thing to take from this, that he's moving toward trying to alienate the images in his pictures from the physical world. And when we put it that way, it really does sound very close, his ideas at least, certainly not the painting style, but the ideas seem very, very similar to Kandinsky's. Remember that Kandinsky is also a Russian, even though he's working in Munich. But both of these artists at really pretty much the same time are trying to increasingly separate the forms on their painted canvases from the analogies to the physical world. There still are linkages back, but they're becoming increasingly strange, and that the artistic form becomes increasingly more important than whatever inspired it in the physical world. This led Malevich in the exact same direction as Kandinsky. It led him into total abstraction, forms that seem to lack any allusions to the physical world at all. And Malevich talked about what he was trying to do. He said he was trying to isolate the parts that lead to sensations in the viewers. He realized that each of the painted elements would in fact cause a reaction, a sensation in the viewer, and he's trying to figure out exactly what those sensations are, what those relationships are, and he's trying to figure out how each part relates to that. And in order to get there, what he has to do is to increasingly isolate them, remove them from any reference to the physical world. At the same time, the titles of these works suggest that they were in fact derived from reality. The painterly realism of a boy with a knapsack. What he's saying, of course, is that this painting of a boy with a knapsack is trying to represent the realism of that. And for him, what he means by the realism is the realism of the sensory experience, the sensation. He doesn't expect you to be able to figure out if the red is the backpack and the black is the boy, or look at it on any level that way. What he's trying to focus on is the pureness of feeling that one gets from visual experience. And as he writes about this, he calls this approach to art suprematism. And what he means by that is the supremacy of feeling. Feeling disassociated from the physical world. Feeling on the metaphysical plane. And using art that is non-representational to investigate what causes us to react, what causes us to feel. For Malevich, he's trying to reduce it to the bare essential, to really pick at that answer. As he does this, I've got some nice details of this picture from MoMA. It's important to note that while the forms are incredibly simplified, the working process is incredibly meticulous. You can see here in this detail that within the red square, there's a darker red square. He's enlarged it at least twice. Can you see that? Here and then here. Each time making the square somewhat larger, working it through. It's gone a little opaque, but also leaving those elements. And then as you can see, not only on the square itself, but on the white ground around it, it's extraordinarily meticulously painted, even though it doesn't have to be. Do you need to lay down your brushstrokes with that amount of variation if all you're doing is creating a white field? Ditto with the red. Here, between the red and the black, we can see those, even the black areas are painted with the same sort of finesse and meticulousness everywhere we look. And paying also extraordinary attention to the boundaries between the works. That little bit of lighter or darker gray that one sees as the white meets the red. Or in the upper right corner, just up in here, you can see how he's come back over and he's really working the brushstrokes in different ways. And I think that this is absolutely important because, when you get to the point when you've left behind all representation, all you have left is the medium, is the paint, and how you handle it. And so when we think about the subject matter of these pictures, on a certain level, the subject matter is not a boy with a knapsack. The subject matter of this painting is, how does Malevich handle the medium? Right? Painting is not a what anymore. Painting is a how. And by calling it color masses in the fourth dimension, he means color masses in time. On a certain level, they float almost supernaturally. But on the other level, of course, I think the elapsing of time is picked up by the brushstrokes, that those become the traces of time passing that he refers to here. I think it's a really wonderful works. Sometimes he gives us these references to peasant life, modernized by art, a boy with a knapsack. Sometimes he gives us aspects of the modern world, where the planes of color, as they float, and he said they all were meant to be seen as sort of floating, that sometimes they evoke aspects of the modern world, such as airplanes. And certainly it's easy to try to pick out, wings, propellers, the body, the fuselage of the plane, but that's not really what Malevich wants us to do. He wants us to sort of think about the sensation. Remember what he said, the pure feeling, the sensation of what it's like to fly. And these metaphors, I think, that he chooses are key, right? When you fly, you're no longer bound by gravity. The modern world, modern technology, has allowed you to soar above the physical world. I think that for him is absolutely crucial. He said, for example, to these suprematists, Malevich said, the visual phenomenon of the objective world are in themselves meaningless. The significant thing is the feeling as such, apart from the environment that calls it forth. He wants us to experience the sensation of flying. And when we look at his suprematist compositions, particularly between 1914 and 1918, we see a prevalence of titles like magnetic attraction, wireless telegraph. All of these are symbols of the modern age, but they're also phenomena that you can't see. They're metaphysical phenomena. They're not bound by gravity, the standard laws of physics as they were understood at that time. These things are these connections between the physical world and something more supernatural, more spiritual, even if that spirituality is reached through the mechanized modern age. Malevich's first realization of the new direction came in 1913, when he painted this extraordinary picture of nothing but a black square on a white field. And you can see the painting has suffered significantly over time. The cracks that we see there were not initially intended as part of the composition, but it's where the paint has peeled apart. He painted it first around 1913, at least that's what he claims, and again repainted it some decade later. And he wrote about arriving at this picture. He said, in the year 1913, I was in a desperate attempt to free art from the burden of the object. I love that part of the quote. Free art from the burden of the object. The objective world around him, representation he sees as a burden, the burden of tradition. And he goes on, he says, I took refuge in the square form. And I exhibited a picture which consisted of nothing more than a black square in a white field. This was his escape. And we should think about that idea of escaping from a burden, escaping into the picture. Because as we look at these things, I think that's exactly what Malevich wants us to do. He wants us to see these pictures as an immersion point, as a window to a different world that is extraordinarily isolated from the physical world around us. Portals to the spiritual realm. Abstract art is often linked with spirituality. Even in earlier times, we find that realism is linked to the physical world, and abstraction or certain lack of realism linked to the metaphysical world, to the spiritual world. The black square picture was first shown at a suprematist exhibition in 1915, And Malevich was at the heart of this, and primarily his works, although others were in it as well. Other suprematist artists were in it as well. And we can see the black square hanging up in the corner there. He titled the exhibition 0.10, the last futurist exhibition of paintings. I think he sees his art in the same way that futurists do, as an agent for change, as a way to push us into the modern world. And he sees connections. They're not formal. They're connections of ideas between what he's trying to achieve with his paintings, a sort of revolutionary change to society, and sees a connection between those ideas and the ideas of the futurists. Doesn't seem to share, however, their fascism. Now, the title, 0.10, there were 10 participants in the show, Malevich and 9 other artists, and each of them was trying to reach the 0 degree of painting. In other words, the bare essential minimum of art, using abstraction to strip away all things that were not necessary, so that we could find out what is the essential purity, the essence, the core foundation of what art is. That's what they're trying to do by using abstraction. Get away from art as a subservient, or a servant, I guess is a better way of putting that, a servant to the physical world. Art that represents is secondary. It serves, a landscape painting serves the landscape. Paintings of animals serve those animals in a way. They get us to look at them in a different way. Painting should be independent from that. Painting should be its own thing. It should have its own core essence. And when we get to abstraction, the painting only refers to the painting. It becomes its own servant, if you will. And I think that's a really important part of abstraction, is it extols the power of painting in and of itself. I want to point to one more thing with this photograph from the 1915 exhibition, is that you'll notice where he's hung the black square, up in the corner, and you might think that this is a out-of-the-way place, insignificant place, but in fact it was the most significant place to hang it for a Russian. Because upper corners of rooms like this was actually where Russians would hang icons in their home, religious icons. Here's a Russian religious icon, and you can see that on a certain level it has a sort of abstract quality. The sort of silhouetted image of the Virgin and Child against a blank gold background. There's sort of an object against a flat, abstract space. And Malevich has given us a modern version of that, and I think he sees these things as modern icons. And just as an icon for the religious would be a portal from this world to the world of the saints, the realm of heaven. So to Malevich's image, and this is why, by the way, they were hung in corners like that, was they brought you off the world and into the heavens. Malevich sees his pictures doing exactly the same thing. They are indeed meant to transport us from the humdrum everyday existence of our world to the more extraordinary spiritual potential of the great beyond. During World War I, 1914 to 1918, Malevich continues to explore these ideas with different forms, different colors, introducing curves. In addition to this, multiplying the forms, changing up the colors, exploring different possibilities of these sort of pure compositions. Juxtapositions of forms that often evoke weightlessness. There's something about this that seems like it's a still from a movie where something's just exploded and things are flying outward from the explosion, some sort of Marvel superhero movie. And again, we go back to the fact that Malevich said that all of his paintings express the sensation of flight. Those are his exact words. There's a sort of weightlessness to the image. But I want to go back to what I said before about these totally abstract images, is that at a certain point the meaning of the painting is painting. The meaning of the painting is how it was painted, not the what of the subject matter. And I think Malevich gets to the same conclusion by dropping these allusions to airplanes and knapsacks and whatnot. It's just a suprematist painting. That's all it is. And there is a focus on every element. You'll notice that between the green bar and the blue bar there is a white space. From a distance it just simply looks like an extension of the white background, but as we come closer we notice that that's a separately painted form, and that it ends sort of here and here, right? That there is in fact a white, slightly bluer white section painted between the green, and it slightly overlaps the green and the blue. This meticulousness of approach is again this reminder that the painting is about the painting. It's not about the world around us. And our job, if you will, as viewers, what Malevich wants us to do is to spend time scrutinizing, to dive into this thing and look at it closely. And he gives us things that reward our activity that way. These meticulousness of the application of paint is one of those things that's there for us. This cream white, you can see how he's built up the paint slowly but surely. Where the gray bar sits against the pink bar, you can see he's left a little bit of the canvas underneath it there, where the colors meet, because these junctures between the painted areas are absolutely key for him, and they have a strength to them. You'll also notice, if you look closely, I didn't notice this until I saw this picture in person, that there's a line leading from the floating red square up. Can you see it? I'll try to trace it. It's sort of right there. Right? Can you see that? It's almost as if it's swinging on a pendulum, and I think these are some of his regulatory lines that he puts down to figure out exactly where to put things on the canvas, but they're there for you to see the longer that you look at the piece. And you can see here's another one, right? There's one right here, give or take, leading from the top red of that grouping upward to the pink box above it. Again, all of this shows us, I think, the process of work. And if we keep in mind that the subject of the painting is not anything that's a what, it's not what is it. The painting is how did it come into being. The subject of the painting is painting, the act of painting. And the ability of that act, the ability of viewing those works, that ability to transport us away from this world and into something sort of more wonderful, something less caught up in unnecessary, boring, day-to-day activities. He continues to reduce, he continues to play with these ideas, and eventually he gets to this idea of the absolute bare minimum, white on white. Certainly no illusion of space, not much of an illusion of depth. There's no color whatsoever. There still is a sense of floating here, and he still continues, even though it's just white on white, to give us this extraordinary precise and meticulous application of paint, paying extraordinary sense to the edges between things, and not just laying the paint down simply with a roller, which would have just been, far too easy. In fact, there's a quote from Malevich that I think I'll end this section of it with. It goes back to our idea of what he expects us as viewers to do, which is to immerse ourselves. He says, with this particular painting, he said what he wanted us to do was to swim in the white, free abyss. And that as we look at the painting, he says, if infinity is before you. These paintings, through their simplicity, offer possibilities, extraordinary possibilities, for escape from the physical world. Now, one last thing I want to mention with this is to notice the date, 1918. If you know your Russian history, this is 1 year after the famous October Revolution, the Soviet Revolution of the Reds against the Tsarist regime in Russia. And it's hard not to think about the fact that Malevich's ideas about art liberating us from the world, from the bonds of tradition, from the physicality of our everyday life, it's hard not to link that to the ideals of the Soviets at this point in their history, where the revolution presented them a bright future, an infinity in front of them of possibility, by having freed themselves from the restrictive traditions of Tsarist Russia. These ideas had been brewing already since 1906. And so, even though this one was painted after the revolution, we should think of Malevich's art as being particularly revolutionary, using modernism, abstraction, to sort of modernize old traditions. Even earlier than that, seeing how mechanization might actually be applied to a rural peasant life and bring it thus into the modern world. Malevich's works are infinitely bound up with this modern movement in politics in Russia in the early 20th century.